Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at Life-Changing Ideas first online event, our very first webinar on the economics of the new normal. My name is Maria Markidou, and I am the head and co-founder of Life-Changing Ideas. For those joining our events for the first time, allow me to introduce you to this initiative. It is an inspirational speaker series organized by the University of Nicosia and Global Training. We host some of the world's greatest minds live on stage in Nicosia, Cyprus. And we talk about business, we talk about inspiration, we talk about transformation. COVID-19 has disrupted our lives and our businesses in an unparalleled and unimaginable way. And as the pandemic continues to challenge our health, our societies, and our economies, we must be ready to face the day after tomorrow. To help us do that, we invited two highly accomplished economists to discuss the economics of the new normal. Before we do that, let me take the opportunity to thank our sponsors who continue to support us digitally. Hellenic Bank is our prime sponsor, CETA and OBAP Cyprus are the champion sponsors, and we are supported by the Research and Innovation Foundation of Cyprus, as well as by Digital Tree as our media sponsor and partner. Let me now introduce you to our speakers. George Papaconstantinou is a professor of economics at the European University Institute at the School of Transnational Governance. He is the former Minister of Finance in the Greek administration in 2009 to 2011, and one of the key policymakers at the outset of the Eurozone crisis. He is the author of the acclaimed book, Game Over, and of Whatever It Takes, the Battle for Post-Crisis Europe. George is an exceptional public speaker and the voice of reason and clarity on European affairs and Eurozone economics. Elias Papaioannou is a professor of economics at the London Business School, and he is the academic director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. This year, he serves as the Varian Visiting Professor at MIT at the Department of Economics. A prominent economist, Elias's research and teaching focuses on international finance, political economy, growth and development, and economic history. Elias received various prestigious awards for his policy papers and research from a number of European and international fora, including the European Investment Bank, the Royal Economic Association, and the European Economic Association. George and Elias, thank you so much for joining in today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mara.
We are ready to start our webinar. And just a couple of house rules for our participants. The webinar will last 1 hour. Participants are muted and the video is turned off, but we welcome a lot of questions. So please pose your questions at the Q&A box if you're watching us with Zoom, and on the chat box if you're watching us on YouTube. We're broadcasting live on YouTube as well, so the webinar will be there for you to watch later on. And if anybody has any problems with connectivity, they can contact us at lci@globaltraining.org. If you have any technical issues, our team will help you out. Great. On that note, let me just say that today we're going to be talking about 3 broad areas: the economics of the pandemic, the global economic shock and the policy response, and the impact on Greece, Cyprus, and the broader region. So let me begin with you, George, and let us know in plain terms the health and economic crisis we face today, if you can explain it in a layman's language. What has happened to our economies since February 2020?
Thank you, Maro. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me pull up some slides which will help me discuss what has been happening in our economies, the economic shock and the health shock. So let me first say that COVID-19 is a polycrisis. We can look at it as the perfect storm. the health crisis itself has shown the limits of EU competence. In other words, what is under the competence of the EU and what is in national capitals, because health is a national issue, it's not an EU issue. The economic recession has proven to be far worse than the Eurozone crisis, and I'll show you some data on that. Our social protection systems have come under incredible strain, not just the health system, but also the welfare systems. European solidarity has been severely tested. Remember in the beginning, we had export controls, the single market fragmented. Democracy and freedoms in Europe in an environment of lockdowns have faced new challenges. We've given ammunition to new populist narratives. In the beginning, especially in certain countries, Italy is a very good example. There were voices about Europe not being there for the country. Disinformation campaigns and the role of Europe in global governance has been questioned. So in a sense, these are not new issues, but they have been magnified and got a new urgency in the COVID area. So what is perhaps interesting to start with is to put up a very simple diagram of the, this is a classic macro relationship diagram, households, government, businesses, and introducing the financial sector and the rest of the world. And it shows very clearly where the virus hits. And the virus hits both on the supply side, because it disrupts global supply chains. With the lockdowns, it reduces labor supply. This feeds into the demand side, where people that are out of work cannot consume. Businesses are reluctant to invest. This feeds again into the supply side. Firms are laying off workers, cutting down production. Even those that have not been locked down are in trouble. And again, into the demand side. So we have a doom loop. And remember that this is the first crisis that we've seen, which is, in a certain sense, its origins are outside the economy. So unlike the global financial crisis or the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, where the origin was the financial system, here the origin is outside the economy, it's in the health sector. And that makes it much more complicated to deal with. And people have tried to sort of mirror the health and economic aspects with what we have come to know very well as the epidemic curve, so flattening the curve, right? So if we look at the top half of the quadrant, we see the red line without containment policies, the blue line with containment policies, and many people have argued that there's a direct relationship between this and the economic situation. So if we don't have containment policies, the recession is worse. If we do have the recession is less because the economy continues, but if we have containment policies, recession is more. And certainly economic policy can reduce the recession with appropriate measures. Now, do take this with a grain of salt, because, for example, we have countries such as Sweden, which had little containment policies, but where we have seen that the actual recession is pretty much the same as in countries such as Denmark and Finland right next door, where there have been serious containment policies. So if we look across Europe and beyond, and here I'm using data from the European Commission, the recent data, you can see the lines in blue are where we thought in 2019 that we would be in 2020. So these are the forecasts done in 2019 for the European economies and China and the world, to the left there, in 2020. And we thought we would all be in positive territory. Then, of course, COVID happened, and the best European country, according to the Commission, will be at the end of the year Poland, with a recession of roughly 4%. We're going all the way down to Greece in the right to a recession of around 10%. So everyone, and this is something we've never seen before, every single country is going to be hit, and will be hit in a major way. Now, notice China on the left there. China is the only country that seems to be able, for the moment, because there's a lot of uncertainty, to just keep its head above water, registering some positive growth, but I'm sure that Elias will talk more about this. So a lot of people have compared this with the global financial crisis. And let's compare 2 years. 2009, which was the worst year for Europe as a whole in the global financial crisis, not for Greece, not for Cyprus. For Greece, it was 2011, for Cyprus, it was 2013. But taking the EU as a whole and comparing with 2020, we'll see that, for example, Italy, Spain, the UK, France, and the EU as a whole are much worse this year than they were in 2009. Same thing with the US, more than twice as bad this year as it was in 2009. Germany, a little bit less now than it was. Japan is the outlier, a little bit better now than in 2009. And China, again, much worse now, but in positive territory. And if you look at the bottom, where you see the growth rate since 1980, you see the big dip in 2009. But there, the world as a whole just managed to stay at zero. It didn't go into recession. Whereas now it seems that we will be going into recession as a whole, meaning that the emerging countries as well. Now, what is very difficult is to plot recovery scenarios. Okay, 2020 is going to be a terrible year, but then do we recover? And do we recover in a V shape? So a big drop in 2020 and a big recovery in 2021? Is it a U shape? Is it a W shape? Or an L shape? And the problem is that most of the uncertainty comes from the health sector. In other words, are we going to have a second wave of infections this winter? When will the vaccine come? So it's practically impossible to look forward with any sense of certainty. So when economists talk about projections, really they should be talking about scenarios, because that's a more accurate way. So what the IMF has done, for example, here, if you look at the diagram on the left, is it plots for the world, for advanced economies, and for emerging markets, 2009, 2020, 2011. And that looks like a V shape. But then the IMF goes a step further and says, okay, what if we have a longer outbreak in 2020? Or if we have a new outbreak in 2021, or both? And then the situation looks much worse. Then you go into a deeper recession, which lasts until 2024, even if you have the combined shocks of a longer outbreak in 2020 and a new outbreak in 2021. So not particularly optimistic in that sense. So to just wrap up this in answering your question, it looks like we're having a global recession, so possibly in emerging markets too, but Elias will cover more of that. It's clear that many sectors are impacted, not just the ones that are related to lockdown, such as transport, restaurants, but eventually even food supply chains, for example, which is one of the sectors that has managed to stay alive in this whole situation. Overall, it seems that the demand effects are probably larger than the initial supply shock. Uncertainty, panics, lockdown policies drive the drop in demand. Investment, especially in small firms and in young firms, which depends very much on cash flow, is severely impacted. And this leads many of them to close. And what perhaps we're focusing less on, but is very important, are the distributional aspects. This is not a symmetric, it may be a symmetric shock, meaning that it's external, but it is asymmetric in the way it impacts not just countries, but also different groups within the country. Women, the young, other vulnerable groups will be hit much more than the average. And we will have an increased inequality of opportunities, of income, and of productivity. And I'll stay at this for the time being.
Thank you, George. It doesn't look good at all. And as you said before, we cannot talk about projections. We can only talk about scenarios. And this change every day or every week or every month. We're going to look forward to these scenarios in the time to come. Turning to you, Elias, let's talk about the world economy, and let's have an overview of the common shock that has produced such diverse effects. And if you can elaborate a little bit on the different type of markets that we face.
Yes, thank you, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here with you and George, although it would have been way better to be in Cyprus. Let me also share my screen. I'll just go quickly over some transparency just to make some simple points here. So If we were to think about the world economy, I think for analytical purposes, we should distinguish between the United States, emerging markets, we can think about frontier or low-income countries, and then we can think about Europe, and I guess we need to discuss a bit more about Europe. But so as to be aware of what we're talking here, the IMF in its forecast, which happened is perhaps already outdated, estimates that the loss in GDP for the world economy is going to be, roughly speaking, $9 trillion US. And since the IMF forecast, all the agencies, this could be rating agencies, it could be investment banks, it could be colleagues that work on forecasting, if anything, they are revising those numbers, pointing to a more severe and more synchronous recession. So this is all we are aware of what it's happening. So there are some forecasts about the US GDP declining by 7%. To give an estimate, the US GDP is hovering around $21 trillion US. And if anything, as I mentioned before, this number is being revised all the time into more and more negative territory. So even the US, we could see a loss of approximately $2 trillion US. This is all the output produced in Italy, to give a comparative viewpoint. There are many unknowns, but there are also some knowns. Dozens of emerging market countries are seeking support from the International Monetary Fund. Many low-income countries are seeking support both by the IMF and the World Bank and the G7, so the group of advanced economies. So this is, if you like, the knowns. Now, I will share the slides with the viewers later, so I don't want to spend that much time here, but to give a broad overview, the following developments happen. The numbers from the United States, let me start with the US, because the numbers, actually the US economy produces very quickly numbers. So these are estimates of what is happening in US GDP now. So this is not a forecast about tomorrow, it is what is the impact of the COVID-19 in the US GDP in the first quarter. So it's something hovering around -1.5 percentage point. For the second quarter, it's something like -9. These are quarterly estimates. They are not annualized. So in other words, if one was to expand this, we would talk about a recession or a contraction of output in the US approximately of 25 percentage points. This is not what will happen because we are expecting a recovery in Q3 and most likely Q4. But as George pointed out, there are many unknowns here regarding the health issue primarily. But what we do know, and this is from the New York Times as of last hour, since the commencement, or if you like, the beginning of COVID-19, 40 million Americans have left the labor force. This is roughly speaking 1 out of 4 of people working in the US. So if this was all to translate into unemployment, we would see unemployment exceeding, for example, 25%. Most likely this is not going to be the case, but we do know that 40 million Americans have lost a job. This, of course, has very severe economic consequences, reflecting, for example, in GDP, but these come also with a social crisis. It's issues related, for example, to household, to family. This crisis will have severe repercussions, if you like, outside the near sphere of economics. Now, what I want to stress here, and this is actually a very interesting, I like this New York Times front page, is already outdated because it's as of May 9. So here you see the ups and downs in US employment since World War II on recessions and output expansions. The New York Times had to use all of its front page to go to the -20 million job losses, which by today exceed 40 million. And if anything, more serious academic work, if anything, suggests that the loss in employment in the US will exceed what we get from preliminary estimates. Now, the US, although the handling of the health crisis has been miserable by the Trump administration, on the economic side has opened the bazooka, effectively mimicking the response of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury in the period 2007-2009. So we have seen a lot of economic and monetary stimulus in the US economy. And this could explain why, for example, the stock market has increased a bit in the past weeks, although there are other reasons that perhaps we'll discuss subsequently. But the big point here is that thanks to various fiscal and monetary policy, very low interest rates, which allows the US government to borrow very cheaply from the markets, actually at a historically low, and when I say historically, we can go back centuries, it was never the case that long-term interest rates were so low. This allows the US economy, the US administration to borrow from the world and then invest heavily in various projects. And let me just remind you that in spite of this very aggressive monetary policy and very aggressive fiscal stimulus, still the consensus estimates of professional forecasters speak about a GDP decline exceeding 7 percentage points of GDP. My hunch will be it's going to be even larger. Now, turning to emerging markets, and I think this is important both for our viewers in the Balkans and also in Cyprus and Greece, we see an Armageddon happening as we speak. This applies both to commodity exporting countries because of the world collapse of commodities, especially oil, but also non-commodity exporting countries. And for example, let me just give you some news. For example, Russia is borrowing heavily from the markets to fund a very huge fiscal deficit. For those who are interested in geopolitics, the popularity of President Putin is at the lowest level since he took power in the early 2000s. Even Saudi Arabia is borrowing heavily from the markets. At the same time, for example, Argentina is already in a technical default. And if anything, all the estimates we get, for example, about Brazil, about Argentina, about Turkey, large emerging markets, all the estimates are revised downwards. And this is a very interesting graph. It's perhaps already slightly outdated because of very quickly evolving conditions. These are the countries, emerging markets and frontier economies that have the highest vulnerabilities. So I'm just zooming at which are the countries. Venezuela, perhaps not surprisingly, a political crisis, a social crisis, coupled with a collapse of its main commodity, oil. But as you see, the countries that are affected, come from all across the world, also Europe, Africa, Turkey, our immediate border, even countries such as Oman or Angola that depend, of course, a lot on oil. So this is going to be an extremely synchronized emerging market crisis like we have never seen in the world. Now, perhaps, and there is a big perhaps here, the good news may come from China that that is already in the exit stage of COVID. Of course, estimates from China should be interpreted always cautiously. So this again comes from the nowcasting exercise of my colleague Lucretia Lacklin. So, for example, the estimate, the Chinese GDP growth declined in the first quarter by something like -6%, which was a huge, if you like, revision. But the estimates suggest that there is going to be a quick rebound, and actually the preliminary statistics point to that, which perhaps leads to what George mentioned before. Perhaps the output contraction in China will not be significant, or perhaps could even not be there. Now, another issue that I think we should all be aware of is that conditions in frontier or low-income countries, think about India, a country of 1.2 or 3 billion people, Ethiopia, a country of more than 100 million people, not to say Nigeria, a country of more than 200 million people, are also under severe stress. And what is the danger there is that all the benefits that we have seen in the past 2 decades on declining poverty rates, which has been one of the significant, perhaps the most significant advance of the world society in the past 2 decades, is going to be reversed. So I think this is something that we should all be aware of. And this, for example, the estimates from the World Bank, you see here world poverty declining, but actually the estimates suggest that this trend will be reversed. The estimates from the United Nations point to a more bleak, if you like, picture. And let me conclude with, if you like, ourselves, the Eurozone or the Euro area, and of course, developments there are unfolding as we speak, actually. So I think that we should distinguish, for analytical purposes, about 2 sets of policies. Policies at the national level, so think about policies that the German administration has announced regarding Germany, that Denmark has announced about Denmark, that Greece has announced about Greece. And there, we should all be, if you like, happy to some extent at least, that the European zone economies and governments reacted actually very quickly, way quicker than they responded back in 2007, 2009. And I guess we'll discuss this later. There is now more and more effort to synchronize effort, joint forces, perhaps issue common liabilities in some form of a bond issued by the European Union Commission, and fund more health issues or recovery, mostly related to environmental and the green economy. Now, vulnerabilities are very high in some countries, and actually Greece is one of those countries that, perhaps in spite of what many of my compatriots think or the administration tells, is a country that the forecast suggests that is going to be hit considerably by COVID-19. Greece has implemented very wise and sound health policies, so perhaps this would help to some extent, but there is a very big question mark there. So what are the things to watch? And I think we are getting more and more good news here, is that more cooperation at the European Union level, especially for policies such as health, which were outside the sphere of the EU bodies, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, and they were mostly at the national level. And I think on the positives, we see this effort for increased European Union risk sharing with the current proposal put forward by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. My last comment is that we should not think, actually it's going to be a mistake to think, oh, we should not care that much what's happening in Nigeria or in India or in Bangladesh regarding poverty, or what's happening in Peru, or the default of Argentina, or the collapse of Brazil has nothing to do with us. The world economy is interconnected, and it's not only the economy that's connected, people get connected. We have a potential migration or refugee crisis looming. Many countries, for example, depend on remittances. So a shock, for example, in Europe can very quickly metastasize in the Philippines. We can have various interconnections of the world economy. And this is something for the world and for our viewers to watch in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Let me pause here.
Thank you, Elias.
Elia, you had a poll.
I had what, George?
Poll.
I had a
poll.
Indeed. So actually, we can. Actually, perhaps it was. I should have asked it later, but let's get to our viewers. COVID-19. Do you believe that it will have the biggest adverse impact on output in the United States, in the core of the Eurozone, Germany, France, the periphery like Portugal and Greece and Cyprus, emerging markets, think Argentina, think about Turkey, or frontier and low-income countries, think about Nigeria, for example, or Bangladesh or India?
Let's just give about 30 seconds for people to vote, and then we're going to see the results. Here we have the results.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Let me just say here that I keep telling to myself an adage attributed to John Kenneth Galbraith that economics forecasting main purpose is to make astrology look scientific and credible. So let me just say here that I don't have much to contribute, but it's interesting for our viewers to see how their views will change as our discussion evolves.
It looks like we have diverse effects in different regions of the world. I was surprised with China that is outperforming everybody. I mean, it's coming back stronger than people thought, because I was actually reading that it opened up to a 60% economy, and that a lot of the factories did not have orders to proceed and process. But it looks like the country that was hit hard by the virus in the beginning, it's recovering faster than the rest.
Maro, let me make a remark here, which I think it's always good for us to remember. China is effectively a continent or a semi-continent. The same would apply for India. So when we say that the crisis hit China, this was truly the case, but it was mostly 2 or 3 provinces out of the 28 or 30 or so. Even when we speak about Italy, let's not forget that the big health tragedy was in 2-3 main areas in Italy. So let's not forget that perhaps we should be careful when we extrapolate saying, oh, China or Italy, when we talk about Denmark, perhaps it's appropriate, but when we talk, for example, about the US, one of the reasons why the numbers in the US have been so dire is because New York and the West Coast have been affected so much. And a significant portion of US GDP comes from the Atlantic and the Pacific coastal areas.
Yes. Okay, let's now focus our attention in Europe, and turning to you, George, let's talk about the EU response to the pandemic and how that affects individual countries in the Eurozone, and whether the response we have seen from the EU is sufficient, whether it's enough to drive our economies forward, and whether these are sustainable policies. And I see that we have a few questions on Europe and the sustainability of the response. So please go ahead, George.
Okay, let me also pull up some slides. And Elias made a very important distinction between the national response and the EU response. So before I go into that, I think it's interesting to start with the very basics. What does economic policy try to do if you're hit with such a crisis? First of all, you better make sure that households have cash in hand and can delay payments, mortgages, rents, utilities, whatever. You need to ensure that workers have paychecks, even if they're in quarantine or temporarily laid off. You need to make sure that firms have cash to pay workers and suppliers. And you need to support the banking system to avoid that the health crisis become a financial crisis. So these are the basics, right? So actually, if you go a step further, you then break this up according to the phases of the crisis, because you have a first phase of full lockdown, and that's where the cash in hand is very important. You have a second phase with gradual opening, where you go from liquidity to solvency. You start thinking of how you support firms. Do you put in equity? Do you guarantee their loans? Or what do you do? And then you have a third phase where you're going to repair and transformation, which is a different set of policies. So indeed, we've seen in every single country substantial resources, both fiscal resources in the sense of cash, grants, or tax rebates, tax holidays, or loan guarantees and other contingent liabilities. In fact, the latter have been much more important than the former. And here you can see that, for example, in Germany and Italy, the loans and guarantees were almost 30% of GDP. In fact, in absolute numbers, according to some calculations, Germany alone accounts for half the guarantees given in Europe to firms. And that's a problem in the sense that it breaks down the integrity of the single market, because if one country can guarantee so much, guarantee loans to its firms to such an extent, and the others cannot, then at the end of this process, those countries' firms will come out even stronger than before. And this was why it's important, and it wasn't important to get a European-wide response. So what has this European-wide response been? And there, let's distinguish between the ECB and the Commission and the Eurogroup. And let's take first the ECB. What most people focus on is the ECB's big asset purchasing program, the PEP. But this is only one part of what the ECB did. The ECB policies were on different levels. Refinancing operations, the TLTROs and the PELROs, so the pandemic emergency long-run refinancing operations, where they effectively subsidize the banks to be able to give funding to firms. They relaxed the collateral policy. This is, for example, why Greek bonds got a waiver, reduced haircuts. And then you have the asset purchase program, which came in phases. The initial phase, and then the additional 120 billion up to December 2020, and then the big bazooka came out with a 750 billion pandemic emergency purchase program. So altogether, more than 1 trillion. I think it's fair to say that the ECB acted fast and acted big. And this is very important in situations like this, especially if you compare with the fact that in the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, it took the ECB 2 years to produce the same kind of impact than it did here in a few weeks. But the ECB is only one part of the puzzle. The other part has been Commission and member states. And there we've had the Commission, first of all, together with, after a Eurogroup decision, deciding to suspend SGP rules because this is what's called the general escape clause in the Maastricht Treaty. And why? Well, because everyone is spending, and they're spending exceeding the 3% of GDP Maastricht limit. So a relaxation of these, a suspension of this SGP rule was necessary, as was the relaxation of state aid rules. This is the only way that, for example, Germany could bail out, as it is doing at the moment, Lufthansa. This is the only way that every country can extend loan guarantees to its firms. Then protecting firms through the pan-European guarantee, that's the EIB coming in, giving national guarantees and increasing the overall EIB capacity to provide guarantees. Then we had protecting jobs, the SURE program by the Commission, where the Commission borrows up to 100 billion and then lends to governments to finance expenditures related to short-time work. That's the Kurzarbeit German kind of scheme. And finally, protecting sovereigns, and the big discussion we've had there around the use of ESM. Remember, the ESM was created for a completely different environment back in 2010, 2011. And the problem with the ESM was that the loans attached to the ESM have conditionality. And there was a long discussion until the Eurogroup agreed that the ESM would lend for longer periods, 10 years, at very low rates, up to 2% of GDP to countries with practically no conditionality. But until this moment, the only country that has actually announced it will claim some loans from the ESM is Cyprus. Other countries have not gone that way. But perhaps the main and the most important tool is the European Recovery Fund that has been announced first by the Franco-German initiative and then followed by the Commission. This is the last few days. The Commission announced its proposal actually yesterday. It's 750 billion. What will the Commission do? It will borrow 750 billion in the markets, distribute 500 billion of that as grants, and 200 billion of that as loans. And when we go a little bit and talk about Greece and Cyprus later, I'll talk about explicitly about what each country gets there. Now, why is this so important? It's important because it breaks a number of taboos. It is the first really mutualization of debt that we're having in Europe. It is important because this comes at a community level. It's not an intergovernmental instrument. And it's also important because you have also the Commission deciding to open up new own resources. It's talking about the digital tax, a carbon tax, and this is all new. And it is a game changer for Europe if this gets approved. And I say if because there are the objections by the so-called Frugal Four countries, with the Netherlands being the most vocal there, and you need unanimity for this. And there's a number of questions about exactly how it's going to operate in terms of the specific instruments, the time frame, etc. Perhaps we'll go into this in some of the questions later.
So when do we expect a vote on this, George?
Well, the discussion is going to start in the next European Council in June. However, it does not look as if we're going to get a final decision on this before September under German presidency. And we have to count ourselves lucky that the next in line is to have to hold the rotating presidency is Germany, because Germany has made a massive U-turn, which would have been, you could not have predicted a few months ago. German public opinion has been slowly moving. It's interesting to debate whether this has something to do with the decision of the German Constitutional Court, but the Franco-German proposal showed a big pivot on the side of Germany, and then Germany chairing the European Council will be able, we hope, to push this through.
Okay, let's move to the topic of inequality and turn to Elias. Elias, we've seen that the impact of COVID-19 to be heterogeneous across countries. And can we talk about the within country differences and the role of inequality on the different regions?
Yeah, so thank you, Mara. So let me just share quickly. I just want to show 4 slides. I'll try to be quick because it's also nice to take questions. So again, this shows the discussion that we have been having, not only now, but also in the past, oh, Greece or the US is recovering, whether the recovery is going to be U, V, or L shape. This is interesting. It should be the starting point. But as we speak, the world economy has its highest levels of income and wealth, and even health inequality that has observed in the past 120 years. So when we say that, oh, in the US we see a fast recovery, which perhaps it's going to be the case, this doesn't mean that all Americans, or perhaps not even the plethora, the majority of the American population or the European population will benefit from this recovery. And why is that? Again, for analytical purposes, we can distinguish two issues. One is pre-COVID-19 trends, and then what's happening, in the past 2 months and what we know about the response of households and firms in the past month that COVID-19 has hit the world economy. Now, of course, inequality is one of those issues that everybody talks. It's very hard, perhaps, to define. Let me try to think about poverty, middle class, and inequality at the top, or if you like, the very, very top. And let me start with the latter. So this is a very famous figure. It comes from path-breaking research by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. It's from the US. Similar patterns one observes in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Canada, in China, actually. So what you see here is that in America, roughly speaking today, 10% of American households get something like half of the pie. Recall that the pie in the US is something like 20 trillion. So it means that 10% of Americans, of households to be more accurate, get home with half of it. Now, what is more interesting though, is that if you just focus to 16,500 families in the US, so this is going to be the 1% of the 1%, well, those Americans, those households will go home every year with something like 5% of the total. So, which means that is this high, low? I leave with this to the viewers. I just want to say that it is in relative terms 5 times as high as it used to be in the US in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And it is now exceeding the level of top-level inequality that existed in the US before the Great Depression and the crash and the New Deal policies. Now, more perhaps importantly, and since we talk about COVID-19 and health, income inequality goes handy with health inequality. And this is a staggering graph from path-breaking research of Raj Chetty and various authors who show that, for example, the richest Americans, the life expectancy if they reach the age of 40 is something like 88 years. But for those Americans who, let's say, they're on the 10th percentile of the income distribution, their life expectancy is something like 10 years less. It's a huge difference of 10 years of life expectancy in the most advanced, quote-unquote, country in the world. And of course, there is a very interesting geography of inequality of health or poverty rates or any other proxy, if you like, of poverty. You can think also about divorces, about the use of opioids, use of drugs, violence against women. Various features tend to be much higher, for example, in the Rust Belt, the former manufacturing powerhouse of the US, vis-a-vis California, Washington State, Oregon, or US or Massachusetts, and New York. And perhaps even more importantly, there is a fading American dream. In contrast to what the Americans believe, the likelihood, for example, today, that you are born, so your parents are on the top quantile of the income distribution, the likelihood that you will make it to the top. When I say top here is the top quantile, so it's not being like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, is only 8%. And in the US, actually, it's way lower as compared to the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and Sweden, so European countries. So the big picture here is that inequality has been very high, and not only inequality at the very top, not only income or wealth inequality, but health inequality, unequal opportunity, high levels of poverty. And what is super interesting and should alert policymakers, business leaders also, and the society more generally, is that, I'll come back to those graphs if we have some time, is that COVID-19 has hit the most those that were the most vulnerable. So this is a graph now coming from my great colleague Paolo Surico and my PhD student Diego Kenzik.
We cannot see the graphs.
We cannot see the graphs, Elias. Do you want to share the graphs?
Yeah, I thought I had.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a graph that comes from ongoing work that uses real-time consumption data from the United Kingdom. The second week of January is standardized for the index to be 100. So what you see here is that average consumption in the United Kingdom, this is real-time, has fallen by 40% in a period of 2 months. This is way higher than the estimates of the Bank of England or the estimates of the Treasury. And not because Diego is a student and Paolo a great colleague, these are way more accurate data because the way governments collect data comes with delays. This is based on real-time consumption tracking using credit card information. Now, what is further interesting is that, let me focus here on inequality, is that the drop in consumption, it applies both to the median household, also to the household at the 90th percentile, but it is especially pronounced for those who are poor. What effective and as a consequence inequality in consumption here, not on wealth or income, on health, has been increased. So effectively, how can the poor sustain that? Here is just one explanation. They run on savings. They had perhaps some money in the bank. They are using those to cope with the crisis. Now, what is, however, very interesting, and I want to stress this perhaps as emphatically as I can, is that you have high levels of inequality, growing poverty rate in the rich club of nations, not in India or in China or in Nigeria, where actually poverty has been falling. And then you have a crisis that hits mostly those who are like below the median of the income distribution. And we have many evidence that the hit on middle income and poor households in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Spain, in Italy, is especially pronounced, let's say, for those who commute with the underground, for those households that are that depend for wage income to survive. So looking forward, this is the biggest, in my view, challenge for the world economy. You had a crisis that hit mostly the vulnerable. Thinking about the corporate sector and jumping on what George mentioned before, even at the corporate side, those firms that have been hit the most are the so-called hand-to-mouth firms, those that were, think of a restaurant in beautiful Limassol that depends on selling some goods in order to purchase, let's say, lovely fish to sell it the next day. And there were growing levels of debt, very little savings, both at the household and the corporate sector, and the crisis has hit, quote unquote, symmetrically in the beginning, but since different households and different firms and different corporates have different buffers, those who are below the median are being affected adversely a lot, while those at the top will survive. Let me pause here. I know that we're also running out of time, and it's going to be nice to get some questions.
Yeah, we're going to share those graphs with everybody, so they're going to get to see the inequalities across regions and countries. Let's move to the third part of the webinar and leave some time for questions. Let's focus on Greece, Cyprus, and the Balkans. And George, if you want to give us your insights on the various government responses, or local government responses, the various stimulus packages that have been provided. And again, please analyze whether these are enough and whether these are sustainable.
Okay, I have only 3 slides here, so let me pull them up. Let's take a look at Greece, Cyprus, and the broader region. And here I've got Bulgaria, Romania as well, and the EU as a whole. So we're talking about GDP declines of minimum 6 to 10. Now take a look at the graph on the side, on the right. These are various projections of what we thought GDP in Greece was going to be in 2020. So back in the ancient years of 2019, which looks like, you know, it's like 20 years ago already, we thought that the Greek economy was going to the Greek government thought that the economy was going to grow by 2.8%. Then in March 2020, be careful, March 2020, the Bank of Greece comes out with its annual big report, and it says growth is going to be 0. Then IOVE, the think tank, comes out in April and says, well, our best case scenario is -5, our worst case scenario is -9. Commission comes out and says -9.7 in April, and the IMF comes out and says -10. So we're talking about a moving target here. And anyone who claims to know exactly where it's going to go, I think is, yeah, basically everyone is if you hear, for example, McKinsey is more optimistic than this. And what will it depend on? Well, it will depend, and that's the same thing with Greece as it is for Cyprus, as it is for other countries of the region. First of all, how much and when will tourism recover in both its direct and indirect impact? Are we going to have 50% of last year's tourism receipts, or are we going to have 20% of last year's tourism receipts? I don't think anyone's talking more than that. What will be the impact of the horizontal measures? So the cash that people have been given, the loans to firms, the tax rebates or holidays on consumption and confidence. How much will banks be hit with a new wave of NPLs? Will they need new provisions? Is the core tier ratio robust? How about revenues, state revenues? Will they be resilient? Already we've seen, of course, that revenues have taken a hit. Maybe the evidence shows that they haven't taken as big a hit as we thought. What will be the evolution of the cash situation? When will the states run out of cash? And what will be the overall growth impact of the national measures? And finally, the impact of the EU package. And to put this in context, let's remember that in Greece, the government has announced a total package of 24 billion, of which about half, 12 to 15 is fiscal, the rest is kind of impact on the economy from leveraging. In Cyprus, only yesterday, a new package of 1.7 billion was announced on top of previous packages. Now, what is going to save the day here is going to be the EU. And this is the table that comes from yesterday's announcement, which shows how much money the different countries are going to get. And here I've highlighted Greece and Cyprus. Greece gets a total of 33.4 billion, of which 22 are grants and the rest can be loans, and Cyprus gets 1.1. Now, do these change the picture? They do to a large extent because they take away some of the bigger fiscal danger of not being able to basically have an expansionary policy of the kind which is necessary given the situation. By the way, the country which gets the most money is going to be Spain with 82 billion euro, followed by Italy with 56 billion euro, and then I think Poland, if I'm not mistaken, is that. So to answer your question, frankly, we don't know how bad it's going to be. We do know that the governments have been doing the right thing. We do know that finally the EU is doing the right thing. But a lot, and I come back to what I said in the beginning, will depend on whether we have the health aspect continue to weigh on the economy. It is going to be completely different if we have a vaccine operational in the fall, which looks extremely unlikely, than if we don't have a vaccine for another 12 months.
We had a few more things to cover, but because we're running out of time, I'm going to sort of round it up and address a few questions because we've got a few questions to address. And I want to ask each of you, I'll start with Elias. Elias, what is your most insightful advice on how to push through the crisis?
Well, this is a very generic, I think, question. So if I was to try to be concrete, is that from the governments, they should not forget that the solution should come from the health, so they should continue subsidizing medicine, health. I think this is a great opportunity to rethink about health policy. And there was this pervasive wisdom actually coming also from my profession that we keep privatizing and things will miraculously improve. COVID-19 has shown that this is not perhaps the way forward. We should think about risk sharing and establishing a social safety net. At the European Union level, more risk sharing is a good thing. Now Greece is benefiting perhaps in the future, Greece will be an even richer country, hopefully, and will have to support others. And this also thinking within Greece or within Germany or within Spain to help those who are mostly in need. And the next, I think, positive that perhaps could come from the crisis is that to really think that the societies, the Western societies that we have been living in, are, becoming more and more unequal. So perhaps 30 years ago, we could speak about the US and the United Kingdom. Clearly, those were capitalist economies, so there was even then inequality. But here, and having lived in the US now for the year visiting MIT or earlier in the United Kingdom, there are growing inequities that are evident, and those societies need to think their social agenda, which effectively links to economy.
Okay, focus on the social agenda then. George, your most insightful advice?
In 30 seconds, two things. One, this is not the time to worry about deficits and debt. And it's not the time to worry about inflation. We will have to worry about all these things, but we'll do it later. Now we need to act fast and act big. And we seem to be doing so for the time being. And the second is that money is one thing, the level is one thing, how you spend is another. It's a unique opportunity to also transform our economies. So it's absolutely right, for example, that the Commission is not just talking about recovery, but it's also talking about transformation, the digital transformation, the green transition. These are very important to put specific goals, because otherwise you're throwing money down the drain. If you're going to end up with the same kind of production paradigm that you had before, you're going to be vulnerable to a different type of crisis further down the road.
Thank you. Let me try and address a few questions. I'm juggling between monitors now, but maybe you've answered that one, but maybe you can comment more. Do you see the measures taken by the EU so far satisfactory for the Eurozone and the EU 27? Are the measures only for the EU 27, George? Do they include the UK, or is it they're gone?
The UK has decided to take its own path, so they do not include the UK.
As far as in this transitional period, they're not entitled to the funds.
I don't think that the UK will sign off on any of these measures, and therefore will not be a beneficiary of any of these measures. There's a question that was asked to us. There's two questions. One, the one that you posed, and will there be enough? And my answer is that yes, if they're voted. And the next question was, what if they're not voted? Because of course, it requires unanimity. There, first of all, I do think that we will have something that resembles, in the end, the proposal we have on the table. Perhaps not exactly the same, but something very close to it. I cannot find a situation, the stakes are too high for this to fail. There is a fallback, a plan B, which is a coalition of the willing, where you move to a intergovernmental agreement if you, for example, the Netherlands decides to simply say no to everything. But I very much doubt in this kind of extreme situations, the EU rallies, even if it's a compromise which does not look exactly like the Commission proposal.
So we're going to be hoping for a compromise. And that's another question. It was also a question that I had for a long time. What will happen if there is a second wave, as bad as the first one, and whether that will dry up the resources of our governments? Because think about it, in a way, I've seen Cyprus at least, we're rushing to open up. We have very good indicators, but on the other hand, we are bringing everything forward. I think the same is done in Greece. We're opening up at tourism, we're accepting flights. It's not clear whether we're going to have strict rules and regulations for tourists coming in. I mean, obviously, there is the appetite to open up as fast as possible. What does that tell us? Elias, you want to comment on that?
Ilya, you want to take it?
Well, I just want to make a couple of remarks here. First is that now, as time goes by, we know more. Doctors know more. Frontline work, doctors know more. Researchers who work on treatments and vaccine know more. Let me just say that this is a time that we have, most of us, gone back to science, and we have seen remarkable inventions in really, really fast time. So 3 days after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, at the publication of Nature, the leading peer-reviewed journal, we had like a full decoding of the RNA of the virus. So I think that if there is a second wave, which people and experts say that it is not unlikely, I think we will be prepared way more on the medical side. On the economic side, I think now governments are doing, first of all, a lot of testing. Some, like France and the UK, do also random testing, so we'll be able much quicker to respond to perhaps some outbreaks and perhaps, lock, not a country, but, perhaps a city or perhaps an island or some area. Third, the use of big data, like the study I showed before, and there are more now, allows governments to do very targeted interventions, something that even, George served as finance minister a couple of years ago. It would have been impossible to target receipts and support at that time. Now we cannot. So I think that it's not unlikely that we will see a second round, but governments will be way more prepared.
There's a question on unemployment here, and it says Greece has the biggest unemployment rate before the COVID-19 economic crisis. Now the numbers are rising, and the EU cannot do anything for the millions of unemployed people, and especially the young ones. Any thoughts on unemployment, George? Because it's also a question for Cyprus. I mean, we don't want to see the picture that we had in 2013 with 17% of unemployment and shops shutting down and being a very grim picture going out of your house.
A couple of comments here. First of all, it does not look as if Cyprus is going to go back to those kind of figures. As far as Greece is concerned, the projection is for unemployment to hit 20%, so 3 or 4 points higher than before. A lot will, two things. First of all, most countries, including Greece and Cyprus, have tried to help people stay in jobs. And the sure instrument, for example, of the EU is going to be able to fiscally support that. We have a different model than the US model, which is that, where the unemployment shoots up, as Elias showed, we try to keep people in jobs. So that's one thing, and I think it's positive what is being done. The second, of course, thing, everything will depend on how fast economies will recover, right? We are trying to keep people in jobs and therefore not destroy parts of the productive fabric, but if tourism does not come back for 2 or 3 years, we're going to get a big hit. And there's not much you can do about that, except support people with money in the intervening period, hopefully retrain them for other activities, etc. So there is no question we're going to have a bump upwards. And it's particularly hard for young people who've been through the Eurozone crisis. If you were 18, 19 in 2009, 2010, you've lived in Greece and in Cyprus a series of crises, and you're now in your late 20s and 30s, and you're still in a crisis. And it's a terrible thing. So the state needs to help in whichever way it can. And one big difference with last time is that I think there's more understanding of the need to come in and help at the moment. If it's properly targeted, it can really avoid unemployment shooting up as it did before.
Okay, that's one last.
May I add also something here?
Yes, sure.
So the big picture here is that for the very first time, the European Union, as an intergovernmental body, decided to directly support workers, not banks, not capital, but workers. Second, there has been all this discussion about more fiscal union, coordination, a Eurobond. We see a proposal which, setting aside the numbers are important, but actually the important thing here is for the very first time, the European Union, the Commission, will go to markets, issue bonds with a very long maturity from what it seems to be the case, with super low interest rates, and will get those proceeds directly to fund employment. It's good that we are asking for more, but let's not forget that the European Union was, is, and will continue to be an incremental project. And if anything, we are seeing concrete steps towards that. The other big picture is that all of those who were complaining, oh, there is no such thing as a Eurobond, they were actually relatively silent on what will back up this bond. And now we see concrete proposals that part of taxation will go directly to the EU to fund those projects. Fourth, as George very nicely commented upon, the European Union Commission is not in the business of making deals, as for example, the US administration is doing, but is saying that this money should go to revamp the health system, to promote research on health, to assist economies and assist employments with a long-term orientation of digital transformation on the environment. This is the super big picture that was unthinkable a couple of years ago.
Yes. Good. There's one more question on the Cyprus government has implied that it might cut public sector salaries. Somebody's concerned about the public sector salaries. And whether the present crisis is mainly a demand crisis, how will this enable the economy to recover, having in mind that the economy is consumption-driven?
It's both a demand and supply side crisis. Cutting public sector wages, I guess the idea there is a burden sharing one, given that you have big losses in the private sector. To the extent that you can afford to not to, you don't have to. So the question is whether if you are in a big crunch, then you may have to do it. If you have less of a fiscal crunch with also the help of the EU, then you can avoid doing it. And I think that's the choice that governments are going to be making. Whether they will ask everyone in the population to make similar sacrifices as we did in the past crisis, or whether this is not necessary to the extent that you can afford at the moment to keep the purchasing power of public servants at the time when the private sector is getting a big hit.
Yes. One last comment from both of you. We're coming out of the lockdown now. Most European countries are slowly getting out of the lockdown. What do you see in terms of consumption, in terms of people going out to restaurants, to places, to the shops? Summer is coming, and at least in Cyprus, it looks okay. It looks like there's a lot of traffic. It looks like people are taking their coffees with their friends. It doesn't look that sad or that grim, but I don't know, Elias, if you have any consumption data to share with us post-lockdown.
Well, we are expecting the new vintage of the papers I showed, because now in the UK and Spain, they have been announced the relaxation of social distancing. So we want to see how consumers respond. We do know from the preliminary evidence that consumption fell not because of the lockdown per se, but because of the uncertainty and people's fear about COVID-19. So for example, I didn't have much time, but you will see in the slides that I will share that consumption in the UK falls 2 weeks before the government announces the lockdown. And this is, of course, rational. Also think about Sweden, although they never implemented an official lockdown. People were unwilling to go and consume because, first of all, they were afraid about their income. So this is what economists call the precautionary saving. So you save rather than you consume. Plus, if you see all the other suffering around, perhaps you're not necessarily in the mood to spend. The big picture, however, looking into the future, I think is that this crisis hit the world economy with very high levels of leverage, which were fueling consumption. If anything, now governments are issuing more and more debt, and government, not only the Commission that we spoke earlier, or the German government, Saudi Arabia is issuing debt. Russia is issuing new debt. Plus big corporates are issuing big debt. So my hunch is that in the future, this model where even middle or lower middle income households were consuming a lot because they could borrow very cheaply, and this was fueling economic activity in some sectors like restaurants or retail or tourism, I think it is reaching its limit.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to round up, and I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank Elias and George for taking time to give us their insights and share their slides. And we've had a lot of comments on slides, and we're going to be sharing everything with the participants. And even though it looks very uncertain, and there's only scenario planning, as George said, I want to finish this on a more positive note and share a small video with everybody and remind everyone that better days are coming. Thank you for attending.
just listen.